Hello, my name is William Pye, and this video will be talking about sentences. This is essentially our first video talking about logic, and the goal here is to go from the idea of grammar and language to transfer into talking about logic and talking about arguments and truth and falsehoods. So let's get into this. So what is logic? Logic is the study of inference, whether in mathematics or philosophy. I myself am a mathematician, but a lot of the ideas that are introduced here are equally true and equally used in philosophical arguments as well. As such, I'm going to try and approach this to where the tools can be used in mathematics, philosophy, or both. Ultimately, the goal is to make and critique arguments to develop further understanding, and the basic building blocks of those arguments are statements, which can be either true or false. As such, some of the basic terms and concepts will actually be introduced from grammar. So things like the notion of a sentence, the subject and predicate of a sentence, as well as a clause. Now, the grammatical notions are more general than those in logic, so the correlation between the two will be addressed as we need to. Also, as you might imagine, this presentation will be given in English, my native language, but the notions can be carried to other languages as needed just as easily. To begin, what is a sentence? Well, depending upon who you ask and what book you read, you may find different definitions and different usages for the word sentence. For our purposes, I'm going to take this definition. A sentence is a number of words put together to express a complete thought. And here are a couple examples of what we're going to be taking to be sentences in this context. So, in particular, the author wrote the novel. So this is expressing the thought that there's a particular person, an author, who wrote, essentially penned down and cobbled together this particular story as this particular book, this novel. So the author wrote the novel. There's a statement of fact here that there's an action that has taken place. What is a man? Well, this is asking a question. Essentially, what are the criteria? What is the definition of being a man in this context? Sand the floor. Well, there's a floor, it needs some maintenance, and someone's going to sand it, and the way this implication is going seems that the person who's listening is going to be the person who's going to be doing the sanding. This is much more of a command, basically giving an order to someone. What a mansion! Well, this one is much more kind of an expression of emotion, of elation, or impressiveness, of amazement at essentially the grandeur of this mansion. So walk in and just see something that amazes you, that surprises you, and it's expressing that particular emotion. Each one of these sentences serves a different purpose. Indeed, sentences have multiple different functions. So specifically, a declarative sentence makes a statement. An interrogative sentence asks a question, an imperative sentence gives a command or makes a request, an exclamatory sentence expresses some kind of strong feeling, and each of the examples from the last slide is an example of each one of these types. The author wrote the novel, for instance, is declarative. You are declaring that this author wrote this novel. What is a man? You're asking the question. You are interrogating the reader. This is an interrogative sentence. Sand the floor, you're being imperial over the listener. You are essentially giving the imperative of sand this floor, giving the command. And what a mansion, you're exclaiming. This is an exclamatory sentence, exclaiming the grandeur of this mansion. In later topics, the individual components of a sentence will be needed, so we'll touch on them here briefly so that we have them available to us later. Specifically, the subject and predicate of a sentence. The subject is the word or group of words that tells what or whom the speaker or writer is talking about. Basically, it's the thing we're talking about. It's literally the thing that either is doing the action, or having an action done to it, or is being described by this particular sentence. The predicate, however, is the part of the sentence that makes a statement about the subject, whether asking what it is, or describing an action that's being done by the subject, or an action that's being done to the subject. So let's look at the four sentences that we've already discussed. So specifically, the author wrote the novel. The subject in this case is the author. The author is the one that's doing this action. And what action did the author do? They wrote this novel. They penned down the words, compiled the story together into this book, this novel. So this author wrote this novel. So the subject is the author, and what did the subject do? They wrote the novel. For the question, what is a man? The subject here is actually a man. The reason being is because if you were to reword this, you're saying a man is what? And you're asking the question, what are the criteria of being a man? So the man is the thing you're trying to describe. You're asking for a description for it. And the question, what is asking for that criteria. That's the thing you're looking for. So you're looking for the description of a man. So a man is the thing you're talking about, and you're seeking a description. Now, for the imperative statement, sand the floor, that one is a little bit more sticky because the subject is not explicitly stated. It's basically the sentence is all predicate. So what is the subject? Well, when you give an order, very often the person you're talking to is understood. You're talking to someone and giving them this instruction, or possibly a group of people. And thus the you in the sentence is understood. You sand the floor. And thus, very often, the you part is omitted. You just say, sand the floor. Thus, the you is not written or stated at all, and the predicate is the sanding the floor. You, the person I'm talking to, take this action, sanding the floor. Thus, very often, orders are actually all predicate. As for the exclamation, what a mansion! The subject of the sentence is the mansion. You're describing this mansion, saying, what a mansion, what splendor, what grandeur of this mansion. And thus, the predicate is just the what part. This is a more unusual sentence. Exclamatory sentences are a bit guilty of this, of not being what you would call grammatically correct, not always having a full subject or full predicate. The reason being is because, since they're exclamations of emotion, very often they're off the cuff, in the moment, and not fully formed. For example, when you prick your finger, very often, ow, or ouch, or if you get surprised, of wow, and whoa. Very often these utterances are one or two words and may not be coherent indeed. Sometimes they're just guttural utterances like and and as such, exclamatory sentences are very often just kind of left to their own devices and are a bit more of an exception than the other three. From these two fundamental components, other elementary structures can be defined as well, specifically the notion of a clause. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a predicate. It's basically the smallest kind of descriptive statement that you can have. An independent clause does not depend on anything else for its meaning, and that's where we get the notion of a simple sentence. A simple sentence consists of one and only one independent clause. And specifically, all the examples we've seen so far are examples of simple sentences. So, the author wrote the novel. Subject, predicate, and it has one independent clause. It needs nothing else for its meaning. That author wrote that novel, and it is thus a simple sentence. What is a man? I'm asking for the criteria of being a man. You have a subject, you have a predicate, and it stands perfectly on its own as a question. The statement, or I should say the command of sand the floor, you who are listening, sand this floor, that is a simple command, a simple sentence as well. And what a mansion, what splendor of this mansion, again, that is a simple exclamation. It doesn't require anything else for its meaning, and it stands perfectly on its own. With the notion of clause in hand, we can build other notions of sentences, specifically the compound sentence. A compound sentence is a sentence that contains two or more independent clauses. For instance, consider this statement. We have the player flipped the card and the game ended. So the player flipped the card is perfectly understood on its own. The player flips over this card, stands on its own just fine. Same thing with the game ended. The game came to a conclusion. The game has concluded. That stands on its own also. However, the two clauses are linked together with the word and. Thus, the player flipped the card and the game ended forms a compound sentence. However, there is another notion of clause besides independent. There's what's known as the subordinate or dependent clause, which unfortunately cannot stand on its own for its meaning. And if you have a sentence that is built out of an independent clause and one or more subordinate clauses, we call this a complex sentence. For instance, consider this one. The player flipped the card, which was the ace of spades. As we said a moment ago, the player flipped the card is itself a independent statement. It stands on its own perfectly fine. Unfortunately, the other one, which was the ace of spades, is a dependent clause. The reason being, the subject is the ace of spades. On the other hand, the predicate is the which was, very much the kind of the question ordering from earlier. The which, however, refers to the previous clause. Specifically, it points to the word card. So the card was the ace of spades. Consequently, which was the ace of spades does not stand on its own, unfortunately. It refers back to the previous clause. Thus, it does not stand on its own for its meaning. It is a dependent clause rather than independent. Now, as logic is concerned with the truth of statements and the validity of arguments, the declarative sentences are going to be the preferred type of sentence, so much so that some books actually define the word sentence this way. In fact, Magnus's For All X states that a sentence is something that can be true or false. Also, simple sentences will act as the atoms from which arguments are going to be constructed. Magnus also states, in this case, an atomic sentence is the basic building block out of which more complex sentences can be built. On the other hand, Suppes and Hill states that an atomic sentence is the simplest kind of sentence, again pointing toward simple sentences. So this is where we're going to end for today. Next time we're going to talk about how to take sentences and actually merge them together or relate them to one another. Here we have a list of all the references I used for making this presentation. We have Magnus's For All X, we have Semmelmayer and Bolander's New Webster's Grammar Guide, we also have Suppes and Hill's first course in mathematical logic. Please feel free to look up any of these books and see what you think of them. And if you like, also leave a comment below or ask a question, and we'll be happy to answer them. And we'll see you next time. See you then.